I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case.
Late summer leaned its hush against the windows, and Oxford, like a cathedral after evensong, seemed to breathe rather than speak. I set Wagner on the turntable to occupy the air, not the mind, and sat with a battered book of poems whose spine answered to my thumb as if we had argued for years. I read a line, then the next, and felt the day thinning to a wire. On the coffee table, the evening crossword waited with pastoral patience. One clue held itself apart from the others, a chaperone at the end of a dance. Call unanswered. Silence prevails. The surface looked simple, which is the most elaborate disguise. I entered letters I did not trust, erased them, tried again, and considered that silence has more names than any of us. The room offered its ordinary orchestra. Stylus hiss and distant traffic, a tap closing like a curt sentence. Lewis had drifted through the station earlier with that practiced brightness he wears when tidings need smoothing. He mentioned, as one mentions rain, a fellow at St. Anselm's found in his rooms, slumped by a telephone with a receiver hanging. The line, he said, had been cut. He added unfortunate, and let the word complete its own work. College business, he supposed. Inner corridors dislike echoes. I know the corridors and their dislike. St. Anselm's keeps its decencies polished and its decay discreet. A cut wire does not belong there. Lines may fray, sockets sulk, bills arrive with piety. But a blade at a cable is the grammar of intention. Wagner marched and then bled into reverberation. I let him go on without me and opened the poems again. On the flyleaf, my pencil had left a Latin tag whose certainty I no longer shared. The past, when circled, grows giddy and sits where it pleases. On the grid I tried unanswered, admiring its tidy fit, then grew suspicious of my admiration. Neatness in crosswords, as in death, can be vanity disguised as proof. I tried nil response and heard, beneath the brass, the dead surf of a telephone left ajar. Call unanswered, silence prevails. Either a lazy setter or a sly one. A clue without machinery drafts the solver into unpaid labor. I poured a small whiskey and watched it settle like an argument that would not be won tonight. The telephone on my sideboard began to look theatrical, an actor learning how to be evidence. I was half inclined to lift the receiver to confirm the line's patient sea noise, as if connection were a habit to be kept in practice. The anecdote returned unbidden, pricked by minor corrections. Lewis had said slumped by the telephone, not at the desk, which meant turning towards sound, the instinct to greet or refuse. He had said the receiver dangling, the line cut in that order, and if his order held, engagement preceded interruption. An ugly geometry. A college likes an ending that spares the rugs. A severed cord stains in a quieter color. Rain began with the courtesy of late August, soft enough to excuse the day and lay it down. I watched the lamps draw, brass filings from the drizzle, and went back to the grid. I erased the confident entry and wrote silence prevails, not as solution, but as caution. If one wished to quieten a voice mid-sentence, a clean cut would serve and would pose as tidiness to those who prefer order to truth. I am, I admit, susceptible to interrupted music and conversations that fracture at the place where kindness might have begun. The record clicked and circled the inner groove without hope of climbing out. Oxford, too, turns about a center it refuses to name. I stopped at the turntable and let the room discover its own silence. Somewhere in St. Anselm's, a room had discovered it already. Curiosity does not argue with melancholy. They share a coat and walk the same streets. I put the book aside, folded the crossword, and looked once more at the telephone. The instrument seemed to wait like a modest witness. I thought of a hand reaching for a call that would not survive its beginning, and of a blade that prefers brevity. Evening had narrowed to a thin, bright, quiet thread. It would not do to leave it unexamined. The porter met us with that expression peculiar to men who are asked to stand guard over tragedy, yet cannot quite resist the pull of curiosity. His keys jangled in the same rhythm as his voice, clipped, deferential, unwilling to embroider. He led us across the quad, and even in late summer the ivy seemed heavier than usual, as if each leaf carried the weight of some unspoken testimony. The stones were wet, though no rain had fallen since dawn. I thought of how moisture lingers in such places, holding on where people cannot. Lewis walked beside me, his tread solid and unself-conscious, a kind of antidote to my own hesitant gait. He murmured that the coroner's man had already been and gone, but the college wished a further look. A natural death, most likely. Yet his voice, so steady in other contexts, carried a faint tremor. Natural deaths rarely summon inspectors to their cloisters. Dr. Edmund Latham had occupied a set of rooms at the back of the North Range. The door yielded to the porter's key with a soft sigh, as though reluctant to admit us. Inside, the curtains were half drawn, the air layered with old tobacco, and that particular mustiness which settles in rooms where books are consulted more often than opened. The armchair in the corner still held the impression of its final occupant. He was slumped there, head tilted, mouth slack, spectacles perched absurdly upon the edge of his nose. The telephone at his side had slipped from his grasp and lay upon the carpet, its cord severed midway as if bitten by some precise, impatient animal. The receiver offered nothing but silence. Lewis bent low, his large hands careful with the small object. "Someone cut this clean," he observed. Not frayed at all. He looked at me for confirmation. I nodded but said nothing. He wanted certainty, and certainty is too brittle a thing to offer at first glance. The doctor had been reclusive, they told us. Devoted to obscure chronicles of medieval taxation, a bachelor by inclination or perhaps necessity. His colleagues spoke of him with that mixture of respect and faint embarrassment reserved for men who had contributed little to college feasts but had survived long enough to be part of the furniture. He lived quietly, and now he had died quietly, unless the silence was staged. I moved about the room. Books everywhere, arranged not by subject but by intimacy, those most worn close to the fire, those unopened exiled to the far wall. I noticed on the desk a thin layer of dust interrupted by a single clear circle where a glass had once stood. No glass now, no water stains, no whiskey scent, merely the ghost of thirst. Lewis asked if it might be suicide. Possible, I conceded. A man alone, weary, perhaps unwilling to continue. But suicide rarely tidies its own apparatus. Why cut the line before surrendering? He frowned, considering. A faulty wire, then. I traced the neat incision with a finger. Faults are rarely so surgical. The window stood open a fraction, just enough for a moth to have entered and lost itself among the curtains. Outside, the quad lay muffled. Students gone for vacation, only pigeons rehearsing their eternal complaints. The hush was the kind that magnifies the smallest sound, a page turning in another man's book, a footstep deciding whether to be heard. The physician who had certified death suggested heart failure. The face, grey and resigned, lent support. Yet my eye lingered on the hand still curved toward the telephone, as though the body had wished to rise but had been commanded otherwise. On a side table lay a small pile of correspondence, envelopes addressed in varying scripts, one half open. I picked it up, a letter begun but never finished, the ink tailing off mid-sentence. There was a quotation, or half of one, from Keats. Something about the nightingale's song. Misquoted, I noticed, though the alteration might have been deliberate. A scholar of history careless with poetry, or precise with subterfuge. Lewis waited by the door, uneasy with the stillness. He asked whether we should call in the technical men. Not yet, I said. A room speaks differently when too many ears crowded. Better to listen first. I looked again at Latham, at the dangling wire, at the quiet rebellion of the moth in the curtains. Suicide, accident, murder. The words balanced precariously, each plausible, each unsatisfactory. The dons of St. Anselm's would whisper in their corridors, weigh reputation against inquiry, and hope the matter folded itself away. But the cut wire would not allow it. A silence too deliberate is no silence at all. We stepped back into the quad, and the evening bells began their minor quarrel across the city, one tower answering another, none in harmony. Oxford has always thrived on such discords. Lewis glanced at me, awaiting instruction. I gave none. The bells were speaking, and sometimes it is better to hear the argument before deciding its winner. Morning draped itself over St. Anselm's with that pale, exacting light which flatters stone and exposes people. Lewis and I were conducted to the master's study, where the books were serried and the carpets yielded with a reluctant sigh. Professor Hartley stood by the mantel, a paper knife loose in his hand like a domesticated danger. He spoke of sorrow, of communal loss, of Edmund's distinguished quietude. When a man repeats distinguished, he is talking about himself. I asked where he had been the previous evening. He produced a dinner, a benefactor, a bottle he allowed to be excellent. Lewis wrote faithfully. Hartley's eyes drifted to a small mirror, as if the room might nod. At the door, unable to resist applause that had not been offered, he reached for Tennyson and landed just shy of the line. Almost, I noted, and beside it, the paper knife he never put down. Outside, the quad smelt of damp limestone and tobacco lingering in stone. Somewhere a staircase creaked as if remembering other feet. Dr. Sylvia Markham received us in rooms the color of vellum, where blinds moderated light into study. A vase of laurel had outlasted its beauty and now illustrated endurance. Her sentences were precise and cool. She had known Edmund for years and found him courteous, if remote. There was a sadness to him, she said, as though his thoughts preferred corridors no one else chose. Almost as an afterthought, she asked whether the line had indeed been cut. I said it had. She paused, and the pause behaved like something involuntary she wished to own as thought. Wiring does fail in college rooms, she observed, and smiled at the civility of her evasion. She admitted she had once supervised Edmund, then corrected herself. Assisted was fairer. The correction rang like a glass set down too carefully. Giles Travers occupied a narrow office colonized by photocopies and unmet deadlines. He told us he had worked late in the Bodleian, preparing a paper whose title entered with ceremony. He regretted Edmund's death, though regret reached the room a moment after ambition. When I inquired about money, he smiled with the fatigue of rehearsed honesty. The young in academia live on promise and gratitude, he said, and allowed gratitude to mislay its smile. He gestured toward tutorial essays and praised Edmund's archival stamina while failing to praise the subject. Taxation rolls may excite the dead, he ventured, and caught himself too late. I asked how well he knew the widow. We have exchanged letters about a bequest, he replied. He let slip that Edmund intended to leave papers to the college. Intentions harden quickly when the intended cannot object. Mrs. Winifred Latham waited in a visitor's room the college had made scrupulously impersonal, as if neutrality could console. She wore grief with economy and allowed it to speak only in the throat. Edmund had loved the North Range, she said, and had been unwell. Telephones bothered him. Cords offended her. Both were nuisances that curled where they should not. When I asked whom he had called, she said she did not know, and the sentence held itself like polished stone. Her handbag, orderly as a desk, briefly surrendered a corner of stiff notepaper stamped with the crest before she eased it back with a motion that disowned itself. She preferred not to discuss colleagues, which is one of the most communicative refusals. Hartley had admired Edmund's discretion. Sylvia had admired his mind. Giles had admired the position he occupied and perhaps the vacancy it promised. By noon, the quad had woken. Lewis asked what I made of them all, and I answered like a man reluctant to be overheard. Each had found a story that placed Edmund's departure tidily inside personal need. Tidy stories suffer the same defect as tidy rooms. Something essential has been put away before anyone is finished with it. A small deduction announced itself without fanfare. Hartley's almost Tennyson, Sylvia's pause at the wire, Giles' eagerness to curate a bequest, the widow's dislike of chords and questions. 4 corners of a shape not yet named. On my pad I let the word silence touch the word line, and between them I drew a wire and left it deliberately, cleanly cut. We returned to Latham's rooms in the shallow light of afternoon, that sallow hour when even the boldest colleges seem briefly ashamed of their splendor. The porter had left the key in trust, and trust, as ever, was a polite way of asking the police to carry the weight of other people's propriety. The carpet sighed underfoot, the curtains had neither advanced nor retreated. The air kept the damp breath of paper left too long unopened. Lewis went to the desk with the steady patience of a man who has learned that drawers often understand more than witnesses. He summoned me without words, a small tilt of the head that preferred discretion. On the blotter lay an unfinished letter, and unfinished felt more accurate than incomplete. It was a draft to no one, or perhaps to everyone, crowded with half-erased quotations, the rubbings white as chalk on the blackboard of better intentions. In the middle, spared the attentions of the eraser, as if protected by superstition, ran a phrase whose calm disturbed me. The nightingale's call cut short. Keats, uninvited, entered as certain guests always do. I read the words around the phrase and found them careful in their carelessness, a scholar's hand that knew how to locate feeling without consenting to feel. In the ode, the nightingale sings into the dark, obstinately alive. Here the call was severed. A metaphor, perhaps, or something less comfortable. At the bottom, 2 initials appeared, then were struck through with an authority determined to be believed. Lewis, satisfied for the moment with the letter's refusal to conclude, produced a small diary from the top drawer. The leather had been worried by a thumb that had perhaps worried other things. The strap yielded at once. Pages had been lifted neatly with the respectful precision of a thief who intends to keep admiring what he has taken. Dates gaped like missing teeth. What remained possessed domestic smallness. An appointment, a notation about a lamp, a reminder to replace a kettle. Between these trifles, the same hand had written a single word twice and then rubbed it almost clean. Listen. The room resumed its waiting. I listened to the courtyard for evidence of feathered explanation, and heard only the tin patience of a bicycle bell and the bored cough of a mower condemned to stripes. The telephone lay where it had lain, receiver asleep beside its small wound. I set it on its cradle and felt the nicety of the cut against my fingers, that tidy absence which good manners call maintenance. On the mantel, a stack of envelopes wore the college crest like a borrowed title. One held the coroner's preliminary hand. Dr. Trent, brisk, apologetic, certain in the way early certainty permits. Heart failure, he had written, while hinting at those qualifiers that allow professionals to share confidence without quite purchasing it. For men of Latham's years and habits, the verdict would fit as well as any gown, but gowns conceal as much as they dignify. I mistrust the usable answer and the tidy death. Lewis asked, not asking whether the phrase meant anything. I told him that poetry misquoted is usually emotion in camouflage, and that a cut song suggests either interruption or mercy, depending on who held the scissors. He considered this and found little comfort in either. He remarked on the missing pages and wondered whether grief edits or guilt curates. Both learn quickly, I said, and left the thought unowned. Under the blotter, A postcard from the Bodleian reminded Latham that a book had lingered beyond custom. On the reverse, he had scribbled a lone word, the ink foxed by a careless droplet. Catabasis, the descent. Scholars carry tragedies like footnotes. I traced the letters and thought of staircase E, which creaks in a key the others decline to attempt, and of a scout who heard raised voices while choosing to name them conversation. The crossword in my pocket yielded nothing generous, yet its empty squares bothered me with familiar charity. Call unanswered, silence prevails. If the letter sought expression and the diary sought deletion, the room managed both at once. A man writes the nightingale's call cut short and soon after dies beside a telephone cut, in fact. Coincidence, if one likes, but Oxford prefers precedent dressed as chance. I have learned to distrust eloquence, particularly when it arrives in the study of an Oxford master. Hartley greeted us that morning with the brittle cheer of a man rehearsed in condolence. He lingered over Edmund's virtues as if reciting a roll call, but halfway through his embroidery, he fastened upon poetry, that safest of cloaks. He claimed to remember an evening in Latham's company, the two of them talking quietly of mortality. To prove his intimacy, he summoned Tennyson, and the words, so familiar to my own ear, lost themselves as they left his lips. He shifted one verb for another, a small trespass, perhaps, but one that startled me with its insistence. Men do not misquote the poets they claim as companions. They misquote only when the encounter itself has been imagined. Lewis, unbothered, continued his patient note-taking. He wrote down the line as given, trusting it to mean what Hartley wanted it to mean. I, however, allowed the error to breathe in the air between us. Hartley noticed, perhaps, for he cleared his throat and turned quickly to administrative burdens, as if governance might excuse invention. His hands played nervously with a pair of spectacles that never reached his eyes. We left the master's lodge and descended into the quad. A scout, apron folded like a shield, intercepted us at the gate. She spoke with that deliberate caution of servants who have survived generations of masters. She had been attending to the fires the night before and had paused near Latham's stair. Voices, she said, carried strangely in those stone wells. She could not swear to words, but the tone was unmistakable. Men arguing, not debating. She had chosen to continue on her way, as all good college servants do. I thanked her, and she looked relieved to have the matter properly acknowledged and properly dismissed in the same breath. Raised voices in a place designed for whispering. It lingered with me as we walked down Holywell. Lewis had made his own inquiries with the telephone exchange. Latham's last outgoing call had travelled to the number of a modest inn on the Botley Road. Lewis insisted we should see what sort of company a reclusive fellow of history kept at such an address. The inn bore a weathered sign and a yard perfumed by hops and motor oil. Inside, the barmaid was brisk with the indifference of one who measures her life in change rattled into a till. Lewis asked about the call. She remembered because it had seemed odd. A nervous young man, early 30s perhaps, had stood at the bar the night before, asking after Dr. Latham and his secret. She laughed as she told us. Inns have always fed on secrets more than sandwiches. She assumed him a crank or a creditor, for he would not sit still and left before finishing his pint. The call, she thought, came later, from someone who asked to be put through. The line had crackled and then died. She assumed it a fault, but faults seldom carry knives. Lewis pressed for a name. She had none. Only the image of fingers drumming on oak and eyes that could not agree where to rest. She remembered also a book he carried, not large, tucked like a guilty volume beneath his jacket. Details betray themselves most easily to barmaids and cabmen. We left with nothing that could be called proof, but proof is a miser. What I carried away was the resonance between Hartley's misremembered poetry and the servant's overheard anger, between the barmaid's nervous stranger and the unfinished letter with its nightingale cut short. The lines refused to join neatly, yet their refusal had the smell of coherence. Back in my rooms that evening, I considered the crossword again. A clue had lingered all's week. Voice altered, sense unchanged, 6. I tried reword, then refit, then recast. At last I saw it, refra. An answer incomplete, almost right, much like Hartley's line. A man misquoting Tennyson was not rephrasing. He was rewriting, altering sense while pretending to preserve it. I folded the paper away, the word only half legible. In matters of death, as in poetry, missteps are rarely innocent. And yet the silence after the cut line remained the truest clue of all. It was in those narrow hours between certainty and doubt that I allowed myself the luxury of conclusion. I had watched Giles Travers with his restless eyes, his hands inked by unfinished lectures, his words flinching whenever money was mentioned. A young man, ambitious beyond his salary, desperate enough to imagine shortcuts. It was easy to see him rifling through Edmund Latham's papers, encountering resistance and silencing it. A stolen legacy, a thwarted benefaction, a line cut both literal and figurative. The barmaid's tale of a nervous visitor with a book concealed beneath his jacket seemed to complete the picture. There is a temptation in policing, as in crosswords, to favor answers that fill the grid neatly. I rehearsed it as one rehearses a confession to oneself. Travers had learned of Latham's intentions, perhaps the leaving of papers or some financial arrangement. He had confronted the old fellow in his rooms, the telephone already alive with Edmund's call for help. A hand on the cord, a knife or scissors, the receiver falling dumb. Rage spilling into silence. It was as good a story as any, and for a while I permitted it to convince me. Lewis accompanied me to Travers' office. The young lecturer sat amid a thicket of photocopies and maps, an academic's barricade against intrusion. He looked tired, which suited my theory too well. I asked where he had been on the evening of Latham's death. He straightened, then, with a steadiness that mocked my conviction, produced a sheaf of papers from his desk. He had been abroad, Florence, tutoring a group of students on a summer program. He pushed forward airline stubs, hotel receipts, the stiff letter of thanks from a director of studies who praised his patience with recalcitrant undergraduates. His voice did not crack. If anything, it grew calmer as mine grew more reluctant. Lewis turned the papers over, his brow lifted as though pleased that a man could be so tidily accounted for. He asked how long Travers had been back in Oxford. 3 days, was the reply. Long enough to attend to domestic duties, short enough that the ink of foreign stamps was barely dry. I felt the sting then, the humiliation not of being wrong, but of having allowed myself to be seduced by symmetry. A neat solution is the most treacherous. Travers saw my silence and pressed the advantage. He admired Edmund, he said, though he had found him reserved. He had corresponded with Mrs. Latham about the possibility of bequests, but such matters were handled above his station. His ambition, he confessed, was scholarly, not financial. I disliked the word confession. It presumed an innocence that need not exist. Yet he met my gaze with something like relief, and relief seldom arranges itself so convincingly without some seed of truth. Back in my own rooms, Lewis poured us both a drink, the ritual of 2 men reconciled to futility. He said perhaps the coroner had been right after all. Heart failure, an end without conspiracy. I told him I did not believe an accident so decorous. He shrugged and reminded me that Oxford survives on accidents, particularly those that suit its dignity. He toasted the city's talent for concealment, and I managed a smile that did not extend to my eyes. We drank in, quiet. Wagner rested unplayed on the turntable. The crossword waited, each square a witness unwilling to speak. One clue mocked me from the margin. Premature conclusion. Error revealed. 5. I had written truth, then changed it to fault, then scrawled guilt. None fit. At last, almost sheepishly, I saw it. False. The simplest of answers, the most wounding. Lewis left with his dependable tread. I remained, the whiskey diminishing in its glass, the silence gathering weight. I had wanted a culprit, and had fashioned one out of hunger rather than evidence. The cut telephone cord, the unfinished letter, the misquoted line of verse, all these still murmured of intention. But Giles Travers had not wielded the knife. I was left with a puzzle returned to its scattered pieces, and the uncomfortable knowledge that my own haste had betrayed me. It is never the mistakes of others that trouble me most. It is my own eagerness to complete the pattern, to claim understanding where only ambiguity should reign. In such moments, Oxford itself seems to listen, amused by my missteps, the bells rehearsing their eternal lesson. That certainty, like beauty, is always premature. I went to Sylvia Markham in the late afternoon, when the light along the high behaves like a lecturer who dislikes applause. Her staircase at St. Anselm's confessed underfoot. The banister had taken the polish of 100 careful hands. Inside, the rooms were orderly in the way of people who survive by tending margins. Shelves stood to attention, spines faded to the color of bone, Greek and Latin in peaceable rows. A bowl of olives waited beside a glass of water where the lemon slice had become ornamental. One lamp domesticated the gloom and made the dust behave. She began with the economy of someone who has taught too long to waste adjectives. Edmund kept his company small and his references exact. Facts consoled him. Verification was his form of prayer. Evenings bored him. Praise embarrassed him. When I asked when she had last seen him, she allowed some weeks, perhaps a month. Time does not run evenly in colleges, she observed. It gathers in corners and resists eviction. Then she paused, not theatrically, and added that he had been writing more letters than usual. Letters to whom, she could not say, or would not. The room smelled of paper and lemon polish. Across the window, a rain streak had dried to a silver thread, residue of a shower that had visited without consequence. She spoke about work because work is the permissible sorrow. The school of Sophocles never did offer consolation, she said. We read tragedy to borrow courage and then return it unspent. She asked whether the telephone line had really been cut. I told her it had, and that the cut was too tidy to be romantic. Her hand, resting on a commentary, withdrew as if from a hot surface. Romance, for some minds, is merely untidiness wearing perfume. We wandered, as conversation will when it cannot proceed directly, toward the country of lives that might have been. Some minds are built for companionship, she said, and some are engineered for solitude. Both are lonelier than they promise. Loneliness behaves like a scholar, too, I answered, forever annotating without contributing. There are loves one can admit only as footnotes, she said. And footnotes, I told her, are where truth prefers to sleep. She did not smile. The air acknowledged the exchange without rewarding it. A kettle clicked somewhere in the college, as though the building kept its own consolations. What she did not say interested me more than what she permitted. She spoke as a colleague, not as a confessor. She praised Edmund's diligence and declined to praise anything else. When I mentioned the master's brave reach at Tennyson, she allowed the smallest shrug, the Academy's exhausted dismissal of sloppiness now too common to punish. Did she and Edmund quarrel? I asked. She turned quarrel like a coin and spent a different word. We differed, she said. On method, on tone, on whether history owes the living any comfort. Did Edmund owe her anything? She ignored the shift in pronoun, which was answer enough for the moment. At a low cabinet, she drew out a thin folder and placed it between us like a treaty. Correspondence with libraries regarding Edmund's borrowing, reminders, permissions, a notice softened by apology. Her fingers hovered above a particular slip, then retreated. The hesitation had the shape of grief, even if grief refused to name itself. Did she know who might have telephoned him that last evening? No, too quickly. Then slower, that he seldom called anyone. She replaced the folder and, almost absently, straightened a pencil so it lay obedient to the desk's edge. Order is the last defense when the past declines to be arranged. When I rose to leave, she walked me to the door. The corridor gave a wooden sigh belonging to older quarrels. Oxford forgives eccentricity more readily than it forgives failure, she said with care. Edmund had not failed, not strictly. She let the adverb hover until it became dusk. Would she dine in hall? Papers to mark, she said, and a headache to curate. Both, I suspected, entirely real. I left her to the civility of work. The quad carried a scent of damp stone and a gardener's thin smoke. The porter, tidying the register, nodded as if we had concluded something. Lewis found me by the gate with the tidings he keeps for after interviews, like mints produced at the end of a difficult meal. He had looked again at the records and found what Sylvia had declined to volunteer. She had supervised Edmund in his first year, not merely assisted, and later examined his thesis with a rigor the college preferred not to remember. She must be hiding something, Lewis said. Perhaps, I told him, or perhaps she is still drafting the sentence that would cost her. He prefers nouns. I am condemned to verbs. We walked toward Broad Street and watched the city attempt evening. Students laughed in that fragile register learned only in vacations. A bus sighed. The Sheldonian proposed a pale gold. While we stood, a deduction arrived with the caution of a shy guest. In Sylvia's cabinet, the slips had been arranged by date except one that sat oddly out of time, older paper among newer ink. Her hand had hovered above it with the wariness of recognition. I thought of the unfinished letter and the nightingale whose call had been cut short. A scholar may mistrust romance and still be loyal to a broken song. I said nothing. Some sentences compose themselves only in silence. Lewis came to me with the photograph folded into his notebook, the edges yellowed with the brittleness of old paper. He handed it over without ceremony, as though he himself did not yet know what he had found. 3 figures stood in a school garden whose hedges had since long dissolved into suburbia. Latham, hair untamed, the awkward tilt of a boy already older than his years. Beside him Hartley, expression fixed in the premature gravitas of future masters. And between them another man, a name faintly penciled on the reverse, Evans, remembered by no one. The picture, Lewis said, had been tucked into a drawer of unused files in the college office, discovered while a clerk searched for something else entirely. Chance often works harder than intention. I stared longer than I meant to. Photographs of youth disturb most when they catch men already rehearsing their disappointments. Latham's eyes were cautious, Hartley's defiant. Evans were blurred, as if he alone had resisted preservation. I thought of the scout's overheard voices, the barmaid's nervous stranger, the missing pages in the diary. Perhaps the past had been calling across the years, demanding acknowledgement. The Bodleian welcomed me that afternoon with its usual severity, the stone-flagged corridors breathing their cool suspicion. The archivist, precise in tone and spectacles, brought me the ledger of loans. Edmund Latham's name recurred, patient as tide. Books of medieval taxation, charters, the administrative husks of forgotten centuries. Yet among them, one anomaly, a collection of poems, printed privately in 1928, of which only 2 copies had been thought to survive. He had borrowed it 6 months before his death, renewed it with unusual punctuality. The volume arrived in a box as though it might disintegrate in transit. I opened it with a care that felt theatrical even to myself. Margins held his annotations, neat but unfinished, a scholar's hand that faltered at the end of sentences. On the inside cover, in another, older script, someone had written, "The truth lies in silence, no signature, no date, merely the sentence, as though a warning or a curse." I traced the ink with my finger and imagined the generations of eyes that had passed it by without comment. Lewis, when I showed him, asked whether I thought it Latham's hand. "No," I said. "This ink belonged to another decade. Perhaps Evans, perhaps someone now lost among the forgotten dawns." "Silence," Lewis remarked, "is always available as an answer." He meant it practically, but I heard more than he intended. I carried the book back to its box and signed the register. The archivist nodded as if I had performed a duty that belonged less to the library than to myself. Walking back across Radcliffe Square, the bells rehearsed their quarrels again. I thought of Hartley, forever misquoting, of Sylvia Markham pausing before she admitted to nothing, of the widow folding paper back into her handbag. The photograph and the inscription began to converse in my mind, a trio of men once bound by something unsaid, an admonition that truth lies in silence. Perhaps Edmund's final call had not been for help, but for recognition of what had been buried too long. In my flat that evening, I placed the photograph beside the crossword. The day's puzzle had a clue that caught my eye. Past remembered, present concealed. 7. I wrote history, then erased it. Memory fitted, then faltered. At last I settled upon secrecy, a past remembered, yes, but only by those willing to conceal the present. The symmetry chilled me. I poured a whiskey and looked again at Evans's blurred face. Why had Latham kept the photograph? Why had Hartley failed to mention him? In Oxford, omissions are the most articulate form of speech. Perhaps Edmund had reached once more for that silence, lifting the receiver to call the one person who might still remember, and someone had made sure the call was cut. Nothing was certain, nothing complete, but the fragments had begun to align, and the pattern that emerged was older than the quarrels of colleagues or the jealousies of scholars. It was the persistence of a betrayal that had never been named, waiting in the margins of books and in the hollow of photographs. A betrayal that had learned to survive by remaining quiet. Hartley grew in. My mind, the way ivy settles on a wall, never asked for ornament. The photograph, with its blurred companion, the inscription about truth and silence, the master's soft heel on any question that risked an echo. Together they made a workable edifice of guilt. I pictured a scandal in youth, a theft of thought, a betrayal ferrying one man forward while another learned to drown quietly. It was simple to imagine the old instinct waking when Edmund disturbed the silt. I carried this neatness through a day of interviews, and the city conspired to support it. Hartley received me again, condolence assembled. He produced a tray of Latham's letters and let me discover how many the tray no longer contained. A clerk's lapse, he suggested. The disorder of estates, the haze grief pours over dates. Whenever the river of talk snagged on a stone, he redirected it with a reference, a cough. Evasion wears respectable shoes. Pressed for recollection, he reached as before for verse. Tennyson reappeared, almost accurate, the almost offered like a gentleman's apology. He performed it lightly, as if precision were vulgar. I thought of the school photograph, a boy rehearsing authority before he had earned it. People do not change. They dry into the shape with which they began. By afternoon, I'd built my first solution to professional height. Hartley, guarding reputation, had confronted Edmund. The old scandal, whatever its bones, had been worried loose by the borrowed book, perhaps by Evans's return in memory. Hartley went to the rooms, found Edmund lifting the receiver, and cut the line. The receiver fell dumb. The stair accepted his exit. The college closed around his absence. Lewis followed with careful caution. It would fit, he said, if the man possessed the nerve. Can vanity supply courage? I asked. Vanity supplies theatre, he answered, which is not the same thing. We looked up at the lodge windows as drizzle turned the air to fatigue, and I felt my answer tilt, not collapse, like a picture refusing to hang straight. One fact pressed like a finger behind the eye, the wire. Panic yanks, panic shouts, panic flees. calculation tidies and wipes a glass, but a clean cut lives between impulse and deliberation. It is the flourish of an amateur conjurer, a gesture that begs notice. Hartley loves appearances too well to risk a trick that invites its own audience. I returned to Edmund's rooms and sat with the telephone while night rose on the quad and made the windows reluctant mirrors. The cord's wound had the precision of ordinary domesticity, not strength but familiarity from habitual tidying. I remembered Mrs. Latham's distaste for cords, the handbag's lawful interior. I remembered Sylvia aligning a pencil until it obeyed the desk. I would not charge either. I was counting who, in this small world, understood the neatness of a cut. The crossword on my knee offered its own instruction. Mask preserved, act recalled, role refused. 8. I set down facade, then rubbed it. Act recalled, perhaps not performance, but past tense. Role refused, identity denied. I wrote aliased and disliked it. Finally, I entered unnamed. I looked at Evan's blurred face and felt the puzzle approve. Toward evening, the scout who had heard raised voices admitted a further recollection. A faint breath of lavender had lingered on the stair that night. Not a room freshener, a person. Men seldom leave lavender. Institutions do. The memory slid into place and leaned its small weight against Hartley's grand silhouette. I considered the solution I had engineered so carefully. It shone, it held, and it rang hollow. Hartley remained what he had made of himself. Vain, evasive, expert at retreat. Yet the cut line looked like someone else's signature. Theater, yes. Cowardice, yes. But not that flourish. My first solution stood like a polished statue, persuasive at a distance and airless up close. I set it aside with the reluctance of a man who prefers wrong certainty to honest dark, and let the bells argue without me. I walked the quad once more, counting steps the way I sometimes count beats in an aria, and felt the college breathe behind its doors. Rain stippled the stone with patient dots, and somewhere a bicycle bell practiced hope. If Hartley was not the hand at the chord, then the past had found another instrument, one tuned to domestic quiet and to memory. I turned back slowly. The letter returned to me late one evening, as letters often do, insisting their incompleteness is a message in itself. I had read Edmund's half-lines a dozen times, tracing the erasures as though they might whisper their origins. Yet it was that single phrase, the nightingale's call cut short, that pressed against me with fresh insistence. At first I had taken it for the melancholy of a man too fond of poetry, perhaps even the misquotation of one. But misquotation had already betrayed Hartley. Edmund was not so careless. A cipher, I thought then. The bird not as bird, but as emblem. The nightingale, long the subject of Sylvia Markham's lectures, her example of tragic endurance in Virgil and Keats. The call cut short, the silence enforced, not by metaphor, but by deliberate act. It was her signal, or his allusion to her. He had been calling Sylvia when the line ended. I returned to the telephone in his rooms, that mute witness whose wound had grown into symbol. I pictured Edmund lifting the receiver, the sound of Sylvia's voice beginning its quiet march across the wire. Perhaps she had heard the hesitation in him, perhaps recognized what he meant to confess. A past affair, yes, the kind that lives more fiercely for its concealment. But more than that, a theft. Edmund had once taken from her, or she from him, something in the realm of scholarship. A line of thought, an interpretation, a passage smuggled from a pupil to a teacher. Oxford sustains its quarrels best when they are written in footnotes. If she had cut the line, neatly, without rage, what then? Not murder. His heart had already been failing, but his last call had sought her acknowledgement, and she had answered with silence. In such moments, biology is content to finish what pride has begun. He died not of poison nor of blade, but of refusal. I thought again of her pencil straightened along the desk's edge, of her hand that hovered above the slip in the cabinet. She had always chosen control where others collapsed. Even her grief appeared tidied into scholarly phrases. She had concealed her supervision of him in youth because to confess it was to admit the depth of their entanglement. And now, even in death, she preserved her silence. Lewis, when I mentioned the phrase again, said perhaps it was only poetry. Edmund liked to dress his thoughts in borrowed feathers, but I knew better. He left clues as scholars leave marginalia, trusting only the attentive reader to find them. We sat later in the King's Arms, the noise of younger voices playing at immortality. Lewis drank steadily, his loyalty as dependable as his gait. I asked him whether he had ever noticed how people remember not what is said, but what is omitted. He frowned, uncomfortable with abstraction, and asked if I had a suspect. I told him we had something rarer, a silence that refused to excuse itself. He looked at me, perhaps wishing for once I would provide a name, a charge, something he could write down. I let the silence between us bear the weight. Back in my flat, I turned to the crossword again, that silent confederate. The clue read, speechless witness, truth withheld. 7. I wrote mute, then erased, unsaid, then doubted. At last, silence. Too obvious, too direct, and yet perfectly cruel. It was then I knew what had happened. Edmund had sought her across the line. She had answered, perhaps with a word, perhaps with none. Then she severed the call, leaving him to the solitude of his armchair, the telephone hanging like a question without respondent. His heart failed in the space where truth might have been spoken. She had not killed him, but she had let him die alone, and the distinction is the sort lawyers are paid to cherish, while the soul discerns none. The truth lay not in what could be proved, but in what had been withheld. I poured a measure of whiskey and allowed it to speak for the dead. Outside, the bells rehearsed their quarrel once more, but fainter now, as if distance were their true intention. I thought of Sylvia, of the way her hand withdrew from the desk as if scorched, of the precision with which she withheld. And I thought of Edmund, receiver in hand, waiting for an answer that never came. The telephone had rung, the line was cut, and in the silence that followed, Oxford itself seemed to incline its head, as if recognizing one of its own most faithful servants, the art of leaving truth unsaid. There is an end to every case, though rarely the sort Lewis would have liked to sign in ink. This one dissolved rather than concluded, leaving stains rather than verdicts. No handcuffs, no headlines, only the college returned to its rhythm of dinners and footfalls, reputations bruised where they could be concealed beneath gowns. Sylvia asked to see me before I left St. Anselm's, not in her rooms nor in mine, but in a cloistered corner of the library where dust performed its slow ballet and the light fractured through colored glass. She spoke with the composure of a scholar delivering a lecture, though her voice traveled softer, almost as if addressed to herself. Edmund had reached for her in those final minutes, and she had cut the line. Not because she wished him harm, she said, but because she could not permit the past to breathe again. They had once shared a closeness the college would never forgive, and from that intimacy a theft had grown. Ideas borrowed, perhaps stolen, turned into the currency of publication. Neither of them could confess it without forfeiting the lives they had made in its shadow. His call had been not only for her, but for exposure. She had chosen silence, and silence, she said, was always her ally. He died not from her act, but from her refusal to act, and yet the guilt had laid its hand upon her as firmly as any knife might. I asked if she loved him still. She answered, after a pause that traveled like a bell fading, that love was not the right word. Love asks for courage, and neither of them had ever offered enough. She reached toward me then, not touching, only allowing her hand to rest in the air as though weighing the distance. For a moment, the library hushed itself around us, and the ache between two solitary people pretended it could form a bridge. I thought of what might have been had we met in other seasons, had we not been so busy defending our aloneness. Then she withdrew her hand, and the world resumed. We walked together as far as the gate. She turned back into the quad without farewell, her figure dissolving into the architecture as though she had always belonged more to stone than to flesh. I knew I would not see her again except in memory, and memory is a poor host. Lewis, waiting at the car, asked whether we had a confession. I told him we had something nearer to explanation, and explanations are rarely useful in court. He accepted it with the patience that was his better virtue. He drove in silence, content to leave words in my custody. Back in my flat, I poured a glass of wine, heavier than usual, and placed the bottle within reach as though I might need the reassurance of its company. Wagner lay unplayed on the turntable, and I let him remain so. Instead, I unfolded the crossword, the one that had sat with me through this case like a companion more loyal than my own deductions. A clue that had taunted me for days stood waiting. Unanswered calls define more than one life. 7. I had tried voicing, then messages, then the absurd prayers. But now the answer offered itself with a cruel grace. Silence. I filled the squares carefully, as if, afraid of smudging. The room received the word without comment. Outside, rain began its patient tapping on the stone, the same rhythm that had followed me through cloisters and quads. I thought of Edmund with the receiver slipping from his hand, of Sylvia folding her grief into footnotes, of Hartley misquoting for posterity, of myself nursing both wine and regret. The case had ended without ending. A man died alone, a woman survived by silence, and I remained, crossword completed, glass half empty, listening to the rain insist on its own permanence. If there was justice, it had chosen a different address. I wrote the word again at the margin, silence, and let the ink spread slightly into the paper. It seemed the only record worth keeping. The telephone had rung, and the line was cut. And I, too, have lived long enough to know that some calls, however unanswered, define us more than those we choose to return.